Well, good morning, church. I'm Ryan. I'm the family pastor here at River's Edge, and it is my joy to be diving into God's Word with you this morning. We are going to be in the Old Testament book of Ruth, so if you have a Bible, you can turn there. If you need a Bible or if you need a pen to fill out your sermon notes, feel free to raise your hand, and one of our ushers can get you what you need. I want to start this morning, not diving instantly into the story, but with a question. Every day, you and I face a choice. Will I choose to live life God's way, or will I insist on my own independence and control, deciding for myself what's wise and best, what's right and wrong for me? This question has been with humanity since the beginning, since the Garden of Eden. When standing before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the man and woman had to decide whether or not to eat its fruits. Now, the issue was not whether or not they'd obey an arbitrary rule. It was how would they pursue wisdom? Because that's what the tree represented, wisdom. And yet I can say I don't think there's any indication that God intended to deny humanity knowledge of right and wrong, to deny us wisdom. Adam and Eve were God's special creation, his image bearers, his partners in bringing life and order to the cosmos. But wisdom ought not come through a magical tree. Wisdom comes from walking with someone who is wise. True wisdom comes from a living relationship with God. It's discovered as we talk with him and trust him, as we wrestle and learn from him, as we follow his word, his way, his spirit. The beginning of wisdom is an awesome respect and humility before God. But our predecessors chose a different path. They went with the magical tree whose fruit promised that they might become a rival center of wisdom and order apart from God. It's a childish response of which we're all guilty. I can do it myself. I want to do it my way. It's not necessarily a rejection of authority, but it is an insistence that it's all about me. And if you know the story, you know the result. Humanity introduced disorder into God's good and beautiful world. And what's worse, we were cut off from the tree of life, losing access to God's abundance, just unquenchable life. And now Jesus in the New Testament says that the same choice stands before us still. He says, enter by the narrow gate. Enter by the narrow gate, he beckons. Because the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. And those who find it are few. Will we choose to live God's way? Or will we forge our own path, trusting our instincts, our reason, and the crowd around us to guide us in the way we should go? I would think that you're here this morning because you're at least contemplating Jesus' narrow path with its promise of joy and flourishing and life everlasting with him. But how do we walk that path? The way forward will be murky. So stay in step with God. That's the first word of advice. Stay in step with God. Jesus himself gives us this insight in the Gospel of John. He says, remain in me, and I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. True wisdom finds its source and center in God. So if we want to walk the path of life, we must learn to remain, to abide, to keep pace and in step with Jesus and what he's up to in our life and in our world. When you choose to chase after Jesus and make your home in his presence, you learn something important. You learn information that is absolutely vital to this journey into God's way of life. You'll know who you are, whose you are, and what your purpose is. He teaches us to know who we are, whose we are, and what our purpose is. Who are you? What did Jesus say? He said, you're my disciple. You're a branch off my vine. You're someone with whom God just delights to live and dwell with. Whose are you? You're mine. Jesus says, my beloved, my grace says that you are my child and I love you, no matter your past, no matter what you've done. And what's our purpose? To live life with God, to love others and to bear much fruit, and so to bring a claim to God's name in our world. So that's how we are to walk the path and step with Jesus, knowing who we are and whose we are and what our purpose is. But it says the road is hard. So what will this road require? Jesus said, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. And as we'll see in our story, it will require an extraordinary loyalty to God. It will require valor. And walking this road will require a heroic commitment to God's way. Extraordinary loyalty. Your brain should be thinking about that Hebrew word chesed by now that we've been talking about over the course of the book of Ruth. Valor is a willingness to run into risk. An heroic commitment to God's way, choosing to live God's life God's way no matter the cost, trusting that he knows the way of life. So how does Ruth speak to any of this? Well, Ruth illustrates for us what it means to live God's life God's way in the midst of the challenges and the ambiguities of real life. And as we dive into the climax of her story this morning, we see her get to live this out. So if you have a Bible, we'll be in Ruth chapter 2. We'll pick it up in verse 19. And just let me remind you a little bit of where we are and where we've been. Ruth is a poor immigrant widow who's been trying to make a fresh start in a distant land. And since her husband's untimely death, she's made 3 momentous decisions. One, she's decided to leave her homeland and her family behind and cling to her mother-in-law, Naomi, vowing to forever be by her side, her daughter always. The second thing she's done is she's given up her place among her pagan people and chosen to live among God's people, the Israelites, in the promised land, even though that means at this point an existence on the margins of society. Finally, she's come to love and trust and devote herself to the God of Israel, to the one true God. In him, she has found grace as he has shown up in her life and extended to her welcome and protection and care. God has really been for Ruth a refuge and an ever-present help in her times of need. And last week we read about how through hard work and the generosity of a local landowner named Boaz, Our widows have been saved from the brink of starvation. And we pick it up today, and Ruth is reporting to her mother-in-law who it is that has so blessed their little family. And we read, "So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, 'The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz.' And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, 'May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness, whose chesed has not forsaken the living or the dead.' Naomi also said to her, 'The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers.' And Ruth the Moabite said, 'Besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young men, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law." So Naomi can sense God's hand through Boaz's actions as he's let them pick up the gleanings of his fields and not starve in this moment of need. She sees God using him to show them God's loyalty and devotion and relentless love. But what's more, she can start to kind of sense that God might be using this man, Boaz, for an even greater salvation. Whether Boaz realizes it or not, he's something called a kinsman redeemer. That means a member of your extended kind of family clan who has the means and the responsibility to help someone in their family recover from a loss. So, for example, say you were tragically murdered or killed accidentally. Your cousin Tony might, after your death, seek to make sure that you found justice. Or if your niece Felicia got into a legal dispute, you might be called upon to help her in the midst of her legal troubles. Or if your son was foreclosed on his house and was now hounded by violent creditors, maybe great uncle Lorenzo would be called upon to buy back the house and to pay off the debts. You see, a redeemer means to bear the cost yourself so that your extended family might keep living on their ancestral land. It's rooted in the fact that when God's people came into the promised land, he gave every extended family an inheritance, a tract of land that would be theirs for generations. And it's the Redeemer's job to make sure the family gets to keep living on that land and in good standing in the community. And Naomi looks at Boaz and says, he's just that sort of guy. He's a close relative of her dead husband, and he has the means to fundamentally change the widow's situation, which is good because they have been surviving off the gleanings of the harvest, picking up what's been dropped, and it is hard to live like that when the fields are completely harvested. So the hungry days are coming. So our two widows wait with bated breath to see how God and Boaz will act. And the months pass and nothing happens. See, Naomi goes back to the drawing board. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it might be well with you?" In other words, shouldn't I find a marriage match for you? Because someone needs to be able to provide for you. Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But don't make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." Naomi thinks, well, maybe Boaz just needs a little bit of a push. Maybe we can jumpstart God's redemption because there's almost no good options left for their family. Ruth could remarry some young Israelite who, finds her attractive, but that would leave Naomi out in the cold because that man would have no obligation to care for her dead husband's mother. Naomi, though an elderly woman, could remarry, find someone to redeem her husband's land that was lost to foreclosure, but then Ruth would have to fend for herself. And then, so Naomi looks at Boaz and like, well, he might be able to solve both problems. So maybe he'll be a good match. But he's been hesitant. Maybe he thinks Ruth is damaged goods. It's not like a former pagan and a penniless foreigner is exactly a marriage material for like this pillar of the community. But she thinks of a plan that might solve their problems. So can we talk about Naomi's plan? It might not be a great plan. It might be a bad plan. She says, okay, Ruth, go get beautiful, bathe, put on perfume, put on your best clothes, make sure that the man can tell that you're eligible for marriage. So far, so good. You're gorgeous. Don't hide what God's given you, you know. But then Naomi tells Ruth to sneak to the threshing floor in the dark of night. It's the last day of harvest. The wheat and the barley have been brought in, and it's been threshed and winnowed, and the edible grain has been piled up in these great mounds. And now the workers tonight are going to start to celebrate the harvest being fully brought in. And these guys celebrate hard. And the night at the threshing floor becomes this raucous affair. And if you're to believe the prophet Hosea, he says at the Israelite threshing floors, the wine flows freely and prostitutes seem to materialize out of thin air to join in the festivities. It is, quite the wild, drunken party. So wait, what was Naomi's plan? Get beautiful, show up to a wild, drunken party, and wait until Boaz is happy and sloshed, and then uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do. I don't want to scandalize you, but to uncover the feet is a Hebrew euphemism. Feet don't mean feet. It's translated in other places in the Old Testament as to expose one's nakedness. So I said Naomi likes to ruffle feathers, to cause a little mischief. She's telling her beloved daughter-in-law to find the well-sauced Boaz at the threshing floor in the dark of night, throw back the old man's cloak, and remember, there's no boxer briefs in the ancient world, expose his nakedness, then cuddle up next to him and see what happens. That's a bad plan. It's a dangerous plan. It's an unethical plan. I don't think I can endorse this plan, Naomi. At best, this is putting Ruth's physical safety and reputation on the line in an attempt to sexually entrap a drunk man. At worst, she's sending her daughter-in-law into a sexual assault. I guess she's thinking, well, Boaz doesn't think she's marriage material. Maybe I can get him to stop thinking with his head and think with another part of his body. Maybe he'll change his mind. Or maybe he'll think, oh, she's a prostitute. It's dark. I can't tell. They'll sleep together. A baby will result. And bing, bang, boom, shotgun wedding. I don't know if Naomi here is choosing to live life God's way. But Ruth agrees to submit to her mother-in-law's wishes. So we read, so she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight's this interesting moment in the ancient Near Eastern mind. It's this moment of ambivalent destiny where things can go either way. It's terror and exhilaration, promise and threat. At midnight, we read, the man was startled and turned over, and look, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" As the cold kind of startles Boaz awake, I'm sure his mind is racing with questions. How much did I drink? Why am I exposed? It's cold out. Whoa, there's a lady here. What did I do? His foggy brain is desperately trying to reconstruct what happened that evening on the threshing floor, and he splutters out into the darkness, "Who are you?" It's a question of identity. Remember, I said the way forward will be murky, so stay in step with God if you seek to walk with him down his road of life. Know who you are, whose you are, and what your purpose is. Whatever Naomi's game was, Ruth has intentions of her own. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Ruth doesn't hide her identity. She doesn't try to pretend something happened to trick and to trap him. She doesn't move to seduce him. She knows who she is, whose she is, and what her purpose is. Spread your wings over your servant, for you're a redeemer. That's an interesting phrase. It's an echo of the blessing that Boaz spoke over Ruth in chapter 2. He had said, "The Lord repay you for what you've done, how much dedication you've shown to your mother-in-law, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge." Now Ruth is inviting him, Boaz, to be God's wings of refuge for her and Naomi. It's within his power to grant Ruth her full reward. Spread your wings also has a second meaning to it. It's literally extend the edge of your garment over me, which you could just read it as, "Hey, it's cold outside, can we share your blanket?" But actually, to a man extending the edge of his garment, his cloak over a woman, was a deeply symbolic act. It was a life-changing act. It showed his intention to marry her. It was a formal mark of betrothal. So, in the darkness, what's actually happening is Ruth is proposing to Boaz. This is bold. This is crazy. It's culturally unheard of. No one would do this, but Ruth does. And then I love Boaz's response here. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness, this last hesed greater than the first, in that you've not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all you ask, for you, as all my fellow townsmen know, are a worthy woman." Boaz is just amazed by Ruth. And he praises her for this new kindness, this new loyalty that she's shown Naomi and him and God. Ruth could have found a husband. She could have married for love or found some other young guy that would have provided for her needs. But it would have meant that she would abandon her mother-in-law. So she refuses. She shows loyalty to Boaz because this is the man who has been so generous and so honoring her in their time of need. She's like, "No, I will not tarnish and ruin your reputation. You're standing in the community for this." Naomi didn't care. She's like, "As long as we get rescued, I don't care if he has a scandal. He can take it." Ruth's like, No. I will not besmirch you in that way." She's all honesty and integrity in her dealings with Boaz. Finally, she shows loyalty to God by not straying from his moral will. The path is murky sometimes, but she knows enough to know what is out of line. She's willing to take incredible risks, to launch out into the unknown, to defy cultural traditions and propose to a much older man. But she would not compromise her character or misrepresent God's. She knows seduction is out of bounds. Lying is out of bounds. Entrapment is out of bounds. Naomi's plan would have forced the issue. Ruth's plan leaves some things to chance, but it also leaves space for God to act. It leaves space for God to act. And Boaz says yes. He accepts the proposal. He says, "You're a worthy woman, and everyone knows it." And that word worthy is interesting. It's usually used of battlefield commanders to talk about their strength and their courage. He's using it for a penniless foreign widow. Why? Because he sees who she is, whose she is, and what her purpose is. She's fiercely devoted to family, to God, to others. She's heroic in her commitment to integrity and doing things God's way, no matter the cost, no matter the risk. And she trusts that God knows the way to life. And then so she'll walk that hard, narrow road with him the rest of her days. That's who she is. Boaz, though, introduces a wrinkle here in verse 13. Or I guess it's verse 12. A little information that the widows didn't know about. He says, "Now it's true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." Apparently, his hesitancy wasn't because of who Ruth was. It was because there was another family member that was first in line to redeem the lost property and to restore their fortunes. And he has been waiting to see if this guy would make a move before he acted. But he says, "Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. And so lie down until the morning." He will step in if this man doesn't and take up their cause as his own. And so the scene ends this way. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment that you're wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. And then she went into the city. And then she came to her mother-in-law. When she came to her mother-in-law, Naomi said, "How did it fare, my daughter?" Can't believe that. Okay. How did it go? It was a bad plan, Naomi. Then she told her that all that man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Naomi replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for that man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Again, Ruth and Naomi have to wait with bated breath to see how God and Boaz will act. But Naomi, with a twinkle in her eye, tells Ruth not to worry. She says, "The man is hooked and God is moving. Take heart and take hope. All will be well." And that's where it ends this morning. Every day, you and I face a choice. Will we choose to live life God's way? Or will we insist on our own independence and control, deciding for us what is wise and best, right and wrong? Jesus says, "I know the way of life. In fact, I am the way, the truth, and the life." He invites us to walk with him. And yes, the way will be murky, so like Ruth, we stay in step with God. We keep front and center. We know who we are, whose we are, and what our purpose is. We know the road will be hard, full of challenges and risks, like it was for Ruth. It will require extraordinary loyalty. It will ask for valor. It'll test if you have a heroic commitment to living life God's way. But at the end of the day, it is the road to life, the only way to joy and flourishing and life that's worth living. Ruth could have gone with Naomi's plan. I keep thinking about this. She could have, but it would have been messy. Trust would have been broken, reputations tarnished, God's honor besmirched. And things could have gone even worse. There could have been rape or violence. We know the ugliness that lives in our world. And it just reminds me of that proverb. There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. But God's way leads to life and hope and redemption and new beginnings. So our application this week is to be encouraged and to take courage from Ruth's example. May her story bolster our decision to live life God's way. May her valor and heart spur us forward on our own journeys as we chase after Jesus together. It is the way of life. It will be hard. It will have risk to it. But God knows what is best. Will we choose to trust him and live life God's way, like Ruth? Let me close this in prayer. Dear God, Lord,